I'm going to hand this right over to my colleague, Sean Dudley. Sean Dudley is the Chief Research Information Officer and one of my most trusted colleagues here at ASU, and is going to be leading a conversation for us around open science and open source. This area of digital trust certainly impacts those of us that are having and navigating our own digital experiences, but it has some really interesting implications for those of us who are trying to create the knowledge by which the next set of experiences might be based. So Sean, I think I'll hand this right off to you and ask you to introduce your panel and jump right in.
Sounds good. Thanks, Donna. Really appreciate this opportunity. This topic is near and dear to my heart. Some of you just heard Jeff talk about an apartment. Well, what do we mean when we want to open up value across those spaces to others? This is complicated, and there's a reason that there's not a ready solution, and why we have to have conversations like this. So for each of the panelists, just offer an introduction and also why this subject is of interest to you, what ties you to this. So start with Janet.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much, Sean. I'm Janet Walko. I'm a professor in the College of Pharmacy at the University of Texas in Austin. I come from a career in the pharmaceutical industry and my own startup. Came to UT in 2008. I consider myself a serial educational innovator these days, starting out with Dr. Kidwell on Take Your Medicine back in 2013 and 2015. My most recent program is in Innovating for Health Equity. My personal attachment to the digital trust issue and open science in particular is really around transparency for the public, to the public, and helping them understand science, as well as access and quality education for everyone. And most recently focusing on making sure we are fully inclusive with marginalized communities or low socioeconomic communities so that we're really building like a worldwide health equity.
Thanks, Janet. Jim?
Hey, good afternoon. I am Jim St. Clair. I'm the Executive Director of Linux Foundation Public Health. Linux Foundation's a 20-plus-year-old 501c6 membership association, and our organizational members are focused on open source software projects such as the Linux kernel, Kubernetes for cloud, Node.js, etc. Mine is one of several what I call industry sector facing projects that seek to build open source solutions for digital health and public health informatics and information. So we have both members and then affiliations with WHO, UNDP, and others around open source software ecosystems to improve health information exchange and health data, as well as digital trust and other areas of the Linux Foundation, where we're working on things like decentralized identity, individual personal data stores, the new Open Wallet Foundation, and some more activities. So great to be here.
Thanks, Jim. Ben?
Hi, pardon me. Nice to be back. I was here this morning. My name is Ben Gansky. I'm a PhD student at Arizona State University. My work focuses on the political and social dimensions of data governance, the stakes that we have individually and collectively in these kinds of infrastructures and decisions. Thanks, Sam. I am particularly drawn to conversations in this open source, open data space with regards to public health, because I think public health is a space where the upsides and the radical downsides of implementing technically, socially, politically insufficient, faulty, brittle infrastructures are both really profound, right? We have great things to accomplish, and there's great risks involved as well. So this is a particularly fascinating space, and one that I'm eager to learn about from the fellow panelists today.
Thanks, Ben. And you highlight something that we're going to start out with, which is there's this tension with what we're talking about, and interesting in terms of, Janet, Jim, for the work that you have to do to get people to buy into the value of these approaches, but also to appreciate and feel as though the right protections are in place. So this tension around open science, and we've heard this discussed many times, but because it's such a practical issue for some of the work that you do, I'd love to understand how each of you frame open science, the value and the safety aspects of it. So if you want to start out, Jim.
Certainly, and I would just offer a big comparison that I see from my vantage point in open source and open science and health between the U.S. nationally and internationally. The U.S. has head down a path where basically everything concerning health data and science generally gets associated with some sort of proprietary system or proprietary system vendors. Outside the U.S., of course, that's quite frankly an opportunity that can't be afforded. So there's very large communities, other foundations, consortiums built around open source electronic healthcare records or open source health information exchange. And as I mentioned before, supported by groups like the large donors, UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, World Health Organization, and others to assist, low and middle income countries with implementing these sort of things. But at the same time, as we just had that wonderful discussion about digital poverty, there's huge swaths of the U.S. geographically that face similar demographic, socioeconomic challenges, social determinants of health problems that can't afford to buy or acquire or maintain the licenses, including at the state Department of Health level, for these expensive commercial solutions. So where are there applications in open source software and technology that can be applied to deliver those solutions in the U.S. in the same way they're being done and funded outside the U.S.? But that's an education, unfortunately, in many cases. And I've spent a lot of time in health IT and federal health IT before coming to the Linux Foundation. And it hasn't been a mindset. It's not a mindset for how tools are acquired or technology is implemented. And of course, it's also very easy to just say, well, we'll hire a vendor to come in and do it all for us because we don't want to think through the difficulties of consensus making and open source developments. But on the flip side, so many commercial solutions in whatever industry sector leverage open source. We typically throw around that 90% of software solutions are inculcated with open source parts and pieces anyways. And those are maintained by communities and collaborative environments. And we apply a lot of our organizational governance to them to be able to manage their life cycle, manage their sustainability and others. So it's just kind of redirecting the conversation around what open source could do instead of just an RFP and an acquisition process and procurement.
Thanks, Jim. Very helpful framing. Janet?
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to take it more from an educational perspective in terms of open science. And it really is more around transparency and access. And what I mean by that, a lot of times people will frame it around access to research information. And that's one aspect. But the transparency that I really think is really important is that, especially being at a public university, where our salaries in healthcare as a faculty member, and I also run an institute, come from the people. And we need to help them understand, and Jim, you touched on this, the importance that people understand information. And so the first effort that I did along with Donna was one of the very early edX courses called Take Your Medicine. It was how drugs are developed and how to be a savvy consumer. And we were constantly questioned on, we understand why you say how drugs are developed, and we went into great depth with 28 speakers, but we also thought it was really important that we give something back to the public in terms of, if you read about a drug recall, what do you need to do? How we did a tour of a pharmacy saying, this is one of your most trusted health individuals, in addition to your physician that you're going to, that can help keep you out of trouble by understanding if you have a drug interaction or something like that. And so that kind of, we have an obligation to the public, and that's something that I've put a lot of effort into in everything I do. The other thing is that when you're at a university, you typically, I thought that there were a lot of silos in the pharmaceutical industry. I see even more silos in education where people are not talking to each other. And so as soon as I saw that, I saw a need to do something. I wasn't required to teach when I first came on campus, but within the second year, I was teaching and developing programs. And part of this is that I now teach one of the only graduate courses that spans the university, and it's around health innovations. But we have MBA students, medical students, nursing students, pharmacy students, engineering students, natural science students, and people from health communications. And it's only when you can create cohorts that are willing to collaborate in a way that you can just really amplify the kind of solutions, and not just solutions, but understanding across disciplines, that you really see what's going on. The other thing that I think is really important from a university standpoint, while some research, it's really up to researchers how much they share their actual research data. And I can't have much of an impact on that. But I also run a service center or core lab for drug and device development. And part of what we do is constant training of people across the campus so that we're not hoarding our tools and resources, but we're trying to train people and being able to have them be able to do these things themselves. It's not that they have to become dependent. And that's something we see not only in the educational sector, but in the public sector as well, that really will impact public health. So those are just a few little things, from an educational perspective. And having worked in industry, what was really frustrating not to be able to address health equity in a meaningful way. I've really found that this is a way you can start to do that. But now it's like Jim and I need to talk. And so that we can put together that educational piece and how you really impact public health at scale.
Thank you, Janet. I'm going to ask a slightly unfair question because I don't know that anyone has a perfect answer to this one, but I want the attendees to know this question is out there. So we talked about public health data at scale, and we talk about something like research. It has fuzzy edges. You get into health system and other sort of quality aspects, even business development aspects. So it's not really clear when we say research or science where the edges are entirely. From a data perspective, even fuzzier, right? We want to bring in other dimensionality and perhaps answer certain things that might lead us to research. So the question I want to ask, though, is when we start talking at scale, and this will segue us into a follow-on conversation about uses of machine learning and so forth, but how do we address the overall? So RHIE in the state of Arizona has 30 million records, that have been gained through all these provider activities, hundreds of providers in the state. So if we want to take a research question, and investigate those 30 million records, where's consent and all that, right? So just to point out that this is, as soon as we start to move to operate in this quote open way, we do in a lot of cases, particularly in health, start to separate ourselves from the traditional consenting process, at least from a practical standpoint, because I can't back channel to those 30 million, not necessarily in total individuals, but over time, particularly someone even in the state anymore, right? So we want to do research. How do we deal with consent when we're trying to aggregate at large scale? If anyone wants to jump on that.
Yeah, Sean, I'll be happy to kick that off because healthcare consent's an area I'm working. Matter of fact, this is my time slot for our usual weekly meeting of a consent working group that I'm part of, which has HIE representatives, state agency representatives, different other industry associations, and we've been tossing this around for a while. And there are what I would call some standards-based approach to consent. But when it comes to healthcare, one of the things that didn't come up in our outstanding panel that we had earlier on is HIPAA, the Health Information Portability Accountability Act, has a section on administrative safeguards for privacy, but consent is considered optional. And I think we sit here in the 21st century and bang our head on the desk and say, well, how can it be optional? But it really reflects how long in the tooth the legislation is getting. So now going back and trying to get that genie in the bottle in terms of consent means looking at the workflows, understanding where consent is appropriate, and changing the mindset and culture of the healthcare industry with how they're used to handling individuals' data. 49 out of 50 states say that the information in the records in the EHR belongs to the owner of the EHR, not the individual. State laws and regulations around consent vary on a case-by-case basis, and in research, they're just starting to get there. So it is a question both, I think, to answer your point around architectural technical considerations, but really policy and workflow. And in my consent groups, we tend to toss around a phrase where I say policy begets architecture and architecture begets policy. You come up with policy ideas and look to see what are technical approaches to do it. And of course, I would advocate open source is the best approach to do that. The flip side is once you can demonstrate what's possible in a technical scenario with architecture, what does that mean for your next step in policy? And I think they have to work hand in hand.
Thank you, Jim. Absolutely. I appreciate that you also highlight there's a big interpretation component to all this. There's differences certainly at the state legislative level, but well beyond that, situated differences among the conversation. So thank you. And I don't know, Janet, did you want to weigh in on that one?
I have a question for Jim because I'm very familiar with, and I don't know if you are with health outcome data. And these are large databases. Is this something that you're referring to in what you were just saying? Because my understanding is, I'm not sure if there was actual consent, but I know that from my understanding, that information is blinded, but used, in a blinded fashion. How does that fit in with what you're talking about in terms of actual consent?
Jim.
If I could add real quick, I know in most cases for that sort of research, what you have to do is follow the HIPAA guidelines for de-identification, which is a way of, and to your point about blinding it, Janet, stripping out personal identifiable characteristics so that I'm just supposedly presented with generic healthcare data about the individual, which is a great point, and I won't steal your thunder in terms of additional comments, but the challenge around de-identified data in the 21st century is I can apply other data sets to it with machine learning and other big data techniques, and in many cases re-identify that data. So what are more ethical considerations of that?
I think that's a great point.
I'd love to jump in on that note, that I think that one of the big challenges this is a broad challenge for open source kind of across the many different locations where open source lives, which is governance, right? Beyond just making, you can't just, we've seen lots of projects of making open data portals sit there unused, or supposedly anonymized information becomes less anonymized because of the proliferation of not just these open data sets, but data sets that are floating around via data brokers. So I think about instances like state-run or university-run portals that will allow only access to a certain number of data points to prevent adversarial identification, re-identification of individuals by cross-referencing data sets. These kinds of interfaces exist. They are a layer on top of open data infrastructures, and decisions about how these things are built are, to Jim's point earlier, not only technical decisions about how few results do we need to return in order to preclude the ability of an attacker to re-identify individuals in a sensitive data set, but also there are political questions, which is about, these are trade-offs, right? So how do we make these trade-offs between, for instance, the value of scientific discovery, the cures or treatments for disease, and on the other hand, the potential harms of re-identification and I'll add one thing in here in the spirit of Sean's question of like, here, just a smoldering smoke bomb in the conversation that anyone can point to and refer to at any point. But the issue becomes, how do we take on this idea of governing long term when our value sets are so different? How do we come to consensus around these kinds of issues, and who has the leverage to make these things actually actionable and enforceable? This question of institutional authority and jurisdiction becomes very, very tricky.
I appreciate that, Ben. And to take another step in the direction of some of the uncertainty that makes its way in when we start going big or going broad or going, so a little more contemporary in terms of advanced approaches. If you'd like to build on that a little bit, because I know you have experience in this area, but if thinking of applying machine learning and getting into situations where explainability or understandability become really problematic, not only on the algorithmic side, also on the data side, potentially. If you want to just weigh in and help to highlight some of that.
Sure. I mean, very simply, we have the supply chain for machine learning applications, machine learning research, both these things, right, is significantly complex. It involves the use of large training data sets to produce models. Those models can be then used seemingly without touching that original data. But we actually, in fact, know from adversarial security researchers that you can query those models in certain ways to then elicit the original data points. There's also issues about ownership here, right? And this is a kind of political economic question about like who owns, who has power, who has the compute power, who owns all the GPUs in order to be able to run these operations. So these are big tech companies, and then even if we're not talking about Google doing their own internal research, we're talking about the fact that if you want to run this kind of research, you need to hire Amazon or Google's computers in order to do this research for you. But the supply chain is that you have training data, you come down to models. You can then use those models to create synthetic data. Who owns that synthetic data? This chain here of ownership is problematic both from a scientific point of view. How am I going to trace the breadcrumbs back to know that this model is giving me robust and resilient results because I know and I trust the data sets that went into its training? Sometimes that is not just accidentally obscured, it's very intentionally obscured. It becomes a trade secret. It's a proprietary information that is legally protected in terms of its secrecy. When we come to even getting into open data and open source infrastructures, this becomes problematic if, for instance, let's say we come up with a system where you want to revoke consent. Sure. How do we untrain a model that has been trained on your data? There's research on this. This is an active area, but it's not solved. And so this idea of the supply chain being one of continual taking huge sets of training data, bundling them down, right, reducing them into models, using those models to create new data sets and so forth. If we're not paying attention to this supply chain complexity, we're not really trying to do that recursive cycle, as Jim said, of policy and architecture. We're going to fall behind.
And lose some important resolution of understanding, no doubt, along the way.
Which is right, has both these moral consequences in terms of consent of the research subject and representative, but also scientific consequences for robustness and resilience of the results.
Right. So along these lines, we can now sort of see the overall complexity of this going well. And the many actors and the many forces and guardrails, either desired or undesired. So probably being too general in saying this, but open source, open data, open science. If we talk about these constructs, these open communities, what they support, what they produce, how they interact, there are exemplars, and I think certainly Linux Foundation understands what many of these are and how to promote success for these communities. But generally speaking, and then Janet, you talked about the need to educate and help people understand, and that you can't necessarily mandate. Let's not forget that in science, the tradition is to hold closely any data of value, as long as you can, wring all value out of it, and then maybe, if you find the time, share it with somebody else. If they discover something, you're still going to go, I wish I'd thought of that. But that has to change, right? Because that's not what the public needs. It's not what society needs. We need more value. I'll offer just a really quick anecdote from the Hubble team. So when we were in DC talking open science with the Hubble team and others, including Texas, they pointed out that for the first year after Hubble was active, only the core science team was allowed to work with the resulting data. After that, the public was allowed to interface, and the impact studies show that when many more people got their hands on what was being produced, an enormous amount of additional impact resulted. And the original science team was blown away by the creativity of those that jumped in the mix later on and felt almost foolish for putting a boundary up in the first place. So how do we create the healthy version of these things? If it's an open source community, open science community, open data community, feel free to take that on from any direction.
Well, I'll start. I'm shaking my head and smiling because that's exactly the sort of thing that we need to be able to scale. And I don't know if anybody has read the book Range. It's about how you can achieve this much if you work by yourself or with people like you. You can achieve this much if you're working with people that have different backgrounds and experiences, and they will bring so much more to something to where it just really exponentially impacts innovation. And if you haven't read the book, it is really a fabulous book. It's called Range. And that's something, I mean, I think that if we want to move from like a university out to the public, because I think you started with that framing, Sean. Part of that is you look at citizen scientists. I mean, I have friends who have become citizen scientists. It's not because they are scientists, but they got interested in something. And that's why I feel like we've been so closed in terms of thinking, I need to work with my community. And people don't always see the impact they can have just taking something out of their normal community to create like greater interest from a broader spectrum of people. And so I use citizen scientists, but it could be anything from, when Donna and I did Take Your Medicine back in 2013 and 2015, 75% of the 24,000 students were from outside North America. And they ended up collaborating together in ways that we had no idea you could do back then. And most people tend to just stay in their pockets. Like you're talking about, the Hubble scientists wanted to only work with their own scientists. So if you're asking how to scale that, I think we have to have examples of where it's worked and then push those out, because currently, at least when I was in pharma and now at a public university, you're not encouraged to do that. You're like, I am an anomaly on my campus. And there's a group of us that are anomalies, but it's all about getting tenure or that next promotion if you're, in a company. And I think we really have to change company cultures, university cultures, to make that part of what we need to do, part of our mission. I always say, put that in somebody's job accountabilities and their performance appraisal, and it'll get people's attention.
I completely agree, Janet. I think we wound up at the same spot as far as, well, what is the incentive structure and how is that, what kind of behavior does that promote? But you describe value and the opportunity then to point to that value, and then ideally recognize when people drive that value. So if that's data citations, different mechanisms that have emerged, you can use data object identifiers for algorithms for data, and then measure the impact of the sharing event itself, or the making things open. And it's wonderful to see that there are even awards being developed, programs being developed to really champion those that share and drive value. The other side of that equation becomes again protection and safety, because driving value for our collaborators and those that share our goals is one thing, and then there's the dual use dilemma of science and promoting advancement in another direction that was unintended. So I appreciate your comments on that. Does anyone else want to comment on that question of how to grow these communities and have them govern and advance?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Sean. That's kind of part and parcel for what we do. And it also relates, I think, in some ways to what Janet suggested around culture. And the open source community on a global basis, of course, is tremendous and can represent itself in different ways. When we go back to my comments about educating states and other officials about use of open source software, there's unfortunately kind of a predilection to say, well, open source software means my brother Larry has something at GitHub. And that certainly exists out there. But when we move into the sorts of open source projects we cultivate that you get within digital public goods that are supported internationally, you are fostering those same communities and broadening the contributions as much as possible around a definable, self-sustainable model using configuration management, lifecycle management, security reviews, so that you don't necessarily put up barriers to limit or inhibit participation, but you manage that participation in a funnel associated with good metrics, good outcomes of understanding who's contributing what's the latest status of the code reviews, and then governing boards and governing activities to shepherd through how those are taken through various stages of their life cycle.
Yeah, I'll add to that. A lot of the value proposition of open source, not all of it, but a segment of it, right, is about this famous premise of Eric Raymond early on of given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, that we're going to get more resilient software and perhaps more resilient data sets, somehow robust because of these eyeballs. But there is not an infinite supply or even distribution of eyeballs, right? So one of the most important existential questions for open source projects is the cultivation and health of a community of contributors and maintainers. And there have been a number of more or less popular stories in the last few years. I could post some links to some about such and such a deeply embedded, hugely infrastructural code library on the internet that's maintained by one person who's not paid for this, living in Idaho, and has diabetes and is 75 years old. And this is seemingly like the way that the internet is held together. And so being able to understand that the cultivation of community is not some kind of natural unfolding process like gravity that is just going to exist for us, or that the intrinsic fun of working on an open source project is going to draw people in. We need to be able to Jim, you said something about create a funnel. I think maybe even more than a funnel, we need to create filters, because we need to understand that the people and the organizations that we invite into our open source projects as contributors, as maintainers, there are trade-offs in who we invite in, particularly when you have value-based projects, which, let's be honest, we're in public health here at the moment. All projects are values-based projects. We have important trade-offs that mean material differences in people's lives and the outcomes of who gets served. And so figuring out whether it's using a more restrictive license like the GPL that says you have to share alike, right? You can't enclose the resulting work for proprietary gain. We need to figure out how we are, and also to Janet's point about incentives and structural incentives, right? How do we get these fits right so that on the project sides, we create hooks that say, these are the kinds of contributors that we're looking for and the kinds of contributions we're looking for them to make. And then on especially public institutions like universities, how do we then meet those hooks with incentive structures to say, we recognize contributions along these lines. We recognize that you are contributing men to this community. We give you points in your tenure package for being a software maintainer, et cetera.
I appreciate that. I don't know if who's keeping an eye on if we have any questions come in through chat, but we are open to that. I just wanted to say, and I know that we don't have a huge amount of time left. Donna, I'm not sure how you want to handle. We've got other questions we could put on the table, or if we want to give folks a chance to weigh in, however you prefer.
There's been a nice conversation here alongside us, and Jeremy Kurtz sharing hilarious, isn't XKCD always just delightful? But I don't see any direct questions in the Q&A, and we do have a little bit more time. So I think you should feel comfortable riffing along these lines a little bit longer. I'm kind of curious, if I were going to ask a question, to maybe pull on the things that Bobby was talking about. She teased a little bit in the consent and sensibility discussion around computational contracts and computational privacy. And so I'm kind of interested in where would you see the obligation to start thinking through how we approach rule sets, how we approach governance, and how we even experiment with that in ways that are meaningful. And I'm thinking, Jim, Ben, some of the kinds of things that I know that happen inside of your world, Janet, with pharma, maybe the first places where we actually see these out in the world. So if we were to bring Bobby's thoughts on computational contracts and computational privacy, where do you think that begins for the kinds of work you're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have found in healthcare, having been involved with it for the last year, that it's really hard. And we got into a great discussion earlier about computational privacy and the contractual considerations of consent. But, speaking strictly from a healthcare perspective, I am not going to educate a 75-year-old Medicaid recipient on how to manage granular consent of a computational use of their health information exchange. It becomes a human factor, a user experience factor as well. So, where is the balance between, excuse me, the balance between simple decisions, discrete decisions that minimize computational privacy risk and your exchange or release of your data, with overwhelming someone trying to, we all go to the websites. The first thing we see is the GDPR pop-up saying we accept cookies. And we all hit yes because we don't really give a damn. But if you break that down into the concepts of what does it mean for your healthcare data, that could change. And contextual application, I'll share my CFR Part 2, my behavioral health information, with my primary care physician. I won't necessarily share it with my podiatrist because he's looking at my feet. How do I build that in as a self-evaluation model that then becomes a computational privacy or granular consent structure? And the cool thing is that we have open source components that have been developed to be able to address that. But again, to that architecture begets policy question, we recognize there's a user experience that places a lot of challenge. Just because I've got the Porsche Turbo doesn't mean I want to go 100 miles an hour to get to the supermarket. And I understand why, because there's governance and there's frameworks, and we have to consider those as practical steps for managing our data, as well as just what we might be able to technically do to protect our data.
I know a couple of our panelists have a hard stop here at the top of the hour. So I want to take a little bit of a moment and thank Sean. Janet, I think you also have to leave. It's so good to see you here, and thank you for this conversation. But Jim and Ben, I might ask that you stick around with me for a while. And I'm
one of the panelists that has to go.
Jim. All right. Okay, Ben.
I'll hop backstage and take my next call, and then I can
I love it. No, totally appreciate that. So please feel like if you have to go, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate the fact that I think it's just really important that we're spending time here. And I will gracefully allow you to exit stage left. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Thank
Absolutely.
You.
But Ben, I think we've got a little bit of time that was set up here.
Sure.
Yeah, there we go. For some Q&A. So I'm going to encourage our audience to ask, and maybe Ben, since I've got you, and I know the kinds of things that you're up to, I'm curious if there are places in this open science discussion where you see there's some really interesting opportunities for us to do some short-term experiments that would require that we're kind of brave, but we just haven't done yet.
Yeah. I mean, I think that to Jim's point about being mindful of amplifying administrative burden, health is an interesting space in that we already have fairly well codified fiduciary duties. We have duties of a doctor to patient. We have duties of a hospital to their patients. We have fairly well codified duties of clinical researchers to research subjects. And I think right now we're playing catch up to bringing our organizations and institutions, researchers, digital conduct and data conduct into line with those fairly well codified responsibilities. And I think that there's, in bringing ourselves up to speed in that way, one of the tactics that we could do is to get into, I mentioned earlier, fiduciaries. So the fiduciary model, for those who aren't familiar, essentially posits that when you have some kind of a provider-client relationship where there's a significant asymmetry in power and information, for instance, between a lawyer and a client, a doctor, a financial advisor, where there's a lot at stake here. There are legally codified duties that this fiduciary, the doctor, the advisor, et cetera, has towards their beneficiary or client. And so there's been some proposals in the data space to create data fiduciaries, right? People who represent not necessarily your individual interests. You don't have to hire them on, but they'd be more like a union rep or someone who stands between you and a group of people to whom you belong. And then on the other side, they are facing, let's say, the NIH or a large research institution or an insurance provider or someone who wants to do something with your data. And so this fiduciary has legally, they're responsible for your best interests. And some fiduciary arrangements have structural accountability to the group that they serve. You vote people into office essentially as your fiduciary. And then that fiduciary takes on that administrative burden and presumably has the requisite expertise to be able to represent the group's interest to the entity that wants to make use of your data. Again, this is a way of doing governance on top of access. Access is step one if we're doing open data, but governance on top of that is where we need to go next. And we have templates for doing that in spaces like health.
I think that's fascinating. Also kind of hearkening back to some of the rather new job titles and roles that we described earlier, and the remixing of, in fact, I think you may have said this earlier, let's leverage some of the systems that are in place now and models that we've got in interesting ways to be able to then solve for a need, but with a very different twist. I'm also kind of curious that you're talking about a role that sounds like it's uniquely positioned between a kind of advocacy for its constituency, but also has a real legal and moral obligation to how they're providing value inside of the work that they'd be doing. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that there's been a number of provisions for the recognition of formal data fiduciaries in the EU. I don't think that actually made it into the final bill, but in the CCPA, interestingly, there is a provision.
That's the California privacy.
Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
There's a provision that allows for individuals to designate as their fiduciary representative a third party to negotiate. Essentially, this gets back to our consent discussion, to negotiate on their behalf for specific affordances and this contract that we think that we're signing when we hit I accept. And the first experiment that I'm aware of on a large scale in this is actually run by Consumer Reports. Consumer Reports is doing this pilot right now where I'm not sure if the window is still open, but if you're a California resident, you can designate Consumer Reports as your representative and they will prosecute your interests with these companies. I'll put a link in chat. I'll find this.
Yeah, please do.
Program. Yeah.
So that's a great example where, Consumer Reports is probably trying to future forecast as to what's their value proposition, what is it that they are known for and do well, and then how do they pivot and create something innovative as they move ahead. They're a really interesting party to do that.
Yeah. And this is, I think, getting into also one of the key questions here, which is who do we trust to do this job and how do we hold them accountable? And this is where, of course, you need that interlock between the carrots of, hey, there's a new market here,
right?
And the sticks of, for instance, if you are a financial advisor and you serve your own interest over your clients, you can be prosecuted. There's a law there that allows for that to happen. If we really want to get serious about this kind of infrastructure of representation, we're going to need to figure out ways to fit that into existing laws or create new laws that will enable us to hold these representatives to account.
Yeah, that's really interesting to try to, I think, what comes to mind for me is how do we actualize that in ways that are pretty immediate? I want to ask us to pivot because I'm getting messages here that Jason Edelstein, who's joined us earlier and is coming back as our plenary, is ready to start.